So without further ado, if you would help me to welcome to the stage Joy White and members of the Section 809 panel.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Here we go.
Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone had a nice evening last night. I heard there was a harbor cruise. Very nice. So we're privileged today to hear from 4 of the senior members of the Section 809 panel. And it's an exciting time in acquisition when we're having the opportunity to do things to streamline our business and to find alternative ways to move faster and continue to implement better buying power initiatives and all of the things that Mr. Kendall put in place several years ago. The Section 809 panel, I just want to talk a little bit about the goals of the Section 809 panel. So there's several of them. Review the acquisition regulations applicable to the Department of Defense with a view towards streamlining and improving the efficiency and effectiveness of the defense acquisition process. Establish and administer appropriate buyer and seller relationships in the procurement system. Improve the functioning of the acquisition system. Ensure the continuing financial and ethical integrity of the defense procurement programs. Protect the best interests of the DoD. And eliminate any regulations that are unnecessary for the purposes described. Wow, you guys got that done yet?
Working hard.
Yeah.
So the panel was stood up in May of 2016 with robust membership and the senior leader of Ms. Dee Lee. And we're very privileged today to have these 4 panel members with us. Starting with Charlie Williams. Charlie is the president of C. Williams, LLC, and the former director of the DCMA. In the DCMA, he led 10,600 military and civilian personnel in the execution of contract management responsibilities covering over 19,800 contractors and $236 billion obligations. Previously, he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Contracting and the U.S. member of the NATO Airborne Early Warning and Control Program Board of Directors. Mr. Elliott Branch, Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Acquisition and Procurement. He's the senior civilian responsible for acquisition and contracting policy for the Navy's multi-billion-dollar acquisition system. He's the principal civilian advisor to the Navy Acquisition Executive, and he serves as the Navy Competition Advocate General and the leader of the Contracting and Property Management Personnel Corps for the Navy. Then we have Terry Raney. Terry Raney is a Senior Vice President and Division Group Manager of CACI International and has been in that role for over 17 years. He provides contract, program, portfolio, and acquisition management and many other services to over 40 federal, civilian, and DoD customers. He's got 43 years of acquisition experience, including being the acting...
You had to say that, right? I remember when you were an intern, okay? At AQC, so it's...
Remember that. It's a very small community.
It is. Be nice to everybody. You're going to see them again and again.
Yeah.
Just live with it, Terry.
I tell you, it's better than the alternative, Charlie.
And then we've got Mr. Darryl Scott, the Vice President of Contracts and Pricing for Boeing, responsible for all contracting policy, processes, ops, and compliance. He's the Boeing representative to industry and government regarding acquisition policy issues, and he's also was 34 years on active duty with the Air Force after graduating from the Air Force Academy and retired as a Major General. In his last position in the Air Force, he was the Deputy Commander for the Task Force to Support Business and Stability Operations in Iraq, Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Business Transformation. So, thank you all so much for being here today. I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion, and I hope the audience as well has some good questions. I'm going to ask a series of questions to start this off, and the panel members will just respond and discuss, cuss and discuss, I guess, as they say. And then we'll open it up if there's time permitted for you all to ask questions. So, my first question, which I'm guessing has already been hashed through quite a bit by the conference, your group. How is the panel addressing the acquisition reform conundrum differently than the many initiatives of the past?
So I'll jump in, Joy, and get this started. First of all, privileged to be here for a second time. This is a great conference. And it's a great opportunity to sit on a panel with my friend Joy here, who we have grown up in this business together for a long time. So thank you, Joy, for facilitating this panel. Let me suggest a couple of things that I think we're doing that offer an opportunity to make some tremendous difference. And it comes to, first of all, the group of folks that have been pulled together to make this happen. I think what you will see different in our panel that's not necessarily always there is a group of individuals who are not only practitioners on the defense side, but practitioners on the industry side. So we have both active industry and government folks available to us. And what makes that important is because many folks like Elliott Branch and Claire Grady will now have to go back and execute what they recommend, right? And so I think it makes a difference having people on the panel who now understand that there's something that's going to have to be executed that relates to the recommendations that they come up with. And I think that's a pretty good thing to have, because as opposed to having a group of consultants like myself who can throw ideas out and think that someone's going to go execute them, now you have folks that are also looking at this because they obviously will have the responsibility of executing. I think the other good thing, and I hearken back to Section 800 panel, and one of the big things that the Section 800 panel did that made a difference at that time was they didn't only throw out recommendations, but they also provided the impetus to make that happen. So whether that's legislation or whether that's regulatory ideas, I think our panel is going to actually lay the foundation for getting things done. And that usually becomes a stumbling block because many panels in the past have just thrown out recommendations, and they're all maybe good recommendations, but they just sit somewhere because no one takes the time to go put them into regulation or make the changes that are necessary. So I think that's going to be a good piece of making what we do reality.
Yeah, I would add to what Charlie has to say by saying in some ways it doesn't differ from previous panels. If you look at music, right, it's all 12 notes, right? You get Beethoven and you get Katy Perry out of the same 12 notes. What differs here, I think, is the context. We are not in a very stable global context. We are not trying to figure out how to tweak a Cold War system. We are in a context where technology and the threat and globalization has us moving so quickly that if we don't figure out how to do something radically different, we will lose the next war. So I think what differentiates this panel from previous panels is not the goal, which is to figure out in the context of a free market system how the government steps out of that to create value for the national defense. But I think the context in which we do that is very, very different today. If we don't figure this out, we will lose. And as an American, I find that unacceptable.
So it's more an imperative that we get it done.
Yeah, I agree with these points. The other thing is it's been about 25 years since we had the 800 panel and Fast and Fair and FAR Part 12 all came in, and there's been a lot of things happen from a regulatory, statutory point that since then. If you think back in history, the FAR was written in 1984. The 800 panel was in 1991, so you had a fairly straight line there of regulation statutes that had come about, and you had many of the people that were involved in writing the FAR, General Slinkard and other people that were also in the 800 panel. So they had a pretty clear line. Today, we're being charged a little bit broader. The language is very clear that it's acquisition regulations applicable to the Department of Defense. And that could be a lot of things. That could be more than the FAR. In fact, we're looking at it that way, and I think that's one fundamental difference. One of the questions you came up with was, are you looking at the 5,000? And the answer is yes, we're looking at how to do that. And we're broadening because we just get so much feedback relative to the financial systems and rules and how that's there as well. And then we also have the issue of it's been 25 years, how many reform efforts, so many things that have been. There was a Sarah panel, there were all these things. And I would just say, the analogy I've used in a few speeches has been, you had a pretty straight line from 1984 to 1991. Now it's more like when you take your Christmas lights down, you kind of put them all in a box and you just want to get them put away. And the next year you got to take them out and you got to unravel all that. And that's kind of where we are today in terms of what do we really change, And that's been a lot of our debate is what would we change and how would we do that? And I think that's a difference as well. Darryl?
I don't have a whole lot to add, but that's never stopped me before. I would also say that Congress has been after this for 3 years now, starting with when Congressman Mac Thornberry took over as the head of the House Armed Services Committee. And Congress is tremendously frustrated that they see the division that Elliott laid in, that it just takes too long to do stuff. And I think what you'll see here is where past efforts have been around either establishing a common regulatory framework. That's what the FAR did. It basically said there's no longer different rules for NASA and the Defense Department and the Department of Agriculture. There's one federal acquisition system. And other reforms aimed at a fairly narrow part of that acquisition system, but assumed the basic framework was just fine. Here, Congress has been telling us, look, you guys, you got to figure out a way to go do this. The motto we've adopted for ourselves is go bold. And it's been clear from our interactions with the members of the House and Senate Armed Services Committee that that's really what they expect. And they've even gone so far as to say, look, if you've read your charter, but if you see something that's out on the fringes of your charter or even outside of the charter that's necessary to do in order to make this work, they expect us to make recommendations in those areas too. So the financial system's already been mentioned, and the other one to look at is the requirements process.
Joe, can I have seconds?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I want to go back to this point that Elliott made, because I think it's important in actually promulgating bold recommendations. There has to be this sort of burning platform for people to really decide to do something bold and different. And this threat that Elliott mentions, this asymmetric threat, if you will, from our adversaries is significant. And I think there's an alignment around this concern, this threat, across the administration, across the Congress. When we first started sitting down as a panel, many of the presentations we heard were about the concern. And recently, I think it was the CNO of the Navy, talked about the fact that our adversaries are working inside of our OODA loop. Essentially, they are outperforming us in terms of speed and agility and ability to get to the latest technology that allows them to have advantages over our warfighter. And that's, as Elliott says, completely unacceptable.
And what's really scary about what Charlie just said is when we said our adversaries are looking for access to the latest technology, they're buying it from American companies. Right. They're buying stuff that we haven't figured out how to buy yet.
And that
ought to scare all of them. Or they're buying the companies.
And those companies want to do business with us, and we have all these things that keep them.
It ought to scare every one of you that there are companies in Silicon Valley that would rather do business with the Chinese than with the United States government. But absolutely true, and that sort of lights the fire under our butts.
So you talked about being bold. Excuse me. You talked about being bold. Did you consider just starting over and just dumping the DFARs or even the FAR?
Yeah. Nothing is off the table. Now, that's not to say that we will dump the FAR or the DFAR, but I think the FAR itself stretches a little past our remit, although it doesn't mean we can't make recommendations. But one of the things we've talked about quite a bit is a radically restructured DFAR, one that doesn't, that if you pick it up and open it up, you wouldn't recognize it compared to what exists today.
Exciting.
But we're not at that stage yet where we're saying this is what it will look like. But I'm going to turn to my friend Elliott, because Elliott was kind of led our framing assumptions group. Elliott, you want to talk about that?
Well, yeah, well, a couple of things. First of all, this dovetails, I think, with this administration's thrust to look at regulation. You may have seen the memo out of OMB that was issued this week that basically said, here are 59 things we're just going to tell you to stop doing right now. The other thing we're lined up to do in the Department of Defense is we are turning over every regulation, everything from uniforms to acquisition to determine whether it should be repealed, modified, or majorly revised. So we're going through Regulatory Reform Task Force in which DPAP is taking the lead, and they are looking at every single provision in the DFARS. And we're going to have to basically make a case to the CMO of the department that we still need that. So there are a lot of things moving in parallel with what we're doing. But we sat down at the beginning of this process, and we came up with some framing assumptions. And they're basically things that you would look at and say, okay, if you fix the system, what behaviors would manifest? And I don't want to talk about them all because we have limited amount of time. But we're talking about things like the solutions being there at the right place at the right time at the right cost. We're talking about things like consistent with protecting the property rights of industry, a collaborative effort on requirements and acquisition between government and industry. We're talking about transparency in that system. We're talking about taking a different look at how we do competition, and I don't want to go into that deeply, but I think what we're trying to think through is, beyond head-to-head competition, but how do you actually harness in this environment competitive forces? Because one of the environment we're in today, is interestingly in dynamic tension with that, right? We're talking about getting to first mover technology, and if you're talking about getting to first mover technology, by definition, you are not talking about a competitive environment. So the question becomes, how do you acquire that quickly while allowing enough transparency in the system to satisfy the taxpayer that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing? So we came out with 8 framing assumptions. There are 4 of the big ones that inform our recommendations and our work as we go forward.
Anyone else on that?
I would just say part of the discussion has sort of led to a discussion around what's the purpose of the FAR and the DFARS in an environment like we have. We've had a lot of people come and talk to us, and invariably the question comes up is, well, what is in the FAR or the DFARS today that prevents you from doing what you want to do? And 9 times out of 10 is, well, really there isn't anything in the FAR or the DFARS that would prevent me from what I want to do. It's the culture, it's the leadership, it's the management, it's all those things. And so then you ask yourself the question, well, is there something that we need to do relative to how the FAR is drafted, how it's written, how it's organized, that would facilitate a different behavior? And that's about incentives, that's about the economics of the market changing. And so we're looking at all those things. That's not easy. That's difficult to harness. But I think there's a growing recognition that we have to consider those things within that framework that Elliott talks about.
All right. Well, your supplemental report states that the panel recommends that it be affirmed that agency mission is the primary goal of DoD acquisition, in contrast to indoctrinating public policy. How do you envision implementing that construct in terms of reform?
Well, we could probably spend an hour and a half on that, but a number of things. One is, as you said, affirming that mission is primary. If you do everything else and don't meet the mission, the system's failed. The second I would say is we spent a lot of time talking about the fact there's one metric missing, which leads to an assumption, and that is that there is no opportunity cost associated with time. That the current system, stuff takes as long as it takes, and there's I think what we're thinking about is also affirming the value of speed as part of the system, and emphasizing that people need to drive in the direction of reacting quickly, getting ahead of trends, that kind of thing. But then, along with all this, one of the things we're going to take up kind of here in our second half of our charter is the workforce. And by the way, I mean, there is nothing wrong with our workforce. We probably have the smartest acquisition workforce that we have ever had. I mean, anybody who's looked out at you all knows that you guys are especially the younger workforce, you guys are a whole lot smarter coming in than I was when I came into this business. So there is nothing wrong with the workforce. What needs emphasis is on how you guys are educated, trained, and led. And that's really, I think, what we have to push hard on, is changing the way we signal expectations to the workforce, because you guys do what we ask you to do. And we got to get to the point where we're asking people to take risks. We're asking people to be innovative. We're asking people to bring forward new ideas, and you don't have to wait 25 years before people are willing to listen to you. That new ideas can come from somebody who's been on the job for a year and a half.
So I think, Joy, this discussion that you see in the interim report around mission, in contrast to sort of public policy goals, is really important, as it gets back to the discussion we were having earlier, and that is the department's mission to go out, fight adversaries, right? And the question becomes, does the acquisition system get burdened with so many public policy goals and objectives, or whatever they are, that it slows it down, makes it less agile, and very difficult to get to sort of that leading edge technology that we need? And as much as we don't like to talk about these kinds of things, and they truly become problematic politically, they're real. I mean, whether it be how we approach small businesses, whether it be how we approach competition, those kinds of things have to be thought about maybe a little differently than we do today if we're truly going to make mission first.
Yeah,
right?
and Charlie's right. I mean, but thinking differently, by the way, doesn't mean stepping away
That's
from.
Right. True. That's right.
I'll use small businesses as an example. We have spent a lot of time talking about the fact that the department does not have a strategic approach to small business, small disadvantaged veteran. Yeah. In that what we do is we give you guys all a goal, and it's kind of, we don't care how you meet the goal. We don't care what you spend the money on to meet the goal. Just get 23%, and we'll call it a day. And we're saying, well, wait a minute. If people are talking about small business being the engine of innovation in the economy, then why aren't our efforts towards small business, women-owned business, minority business, why aren't they targeted towards finding those capabilities, finding those companies that have the ability to move fast, rather than simply saying, well, if I give all the grass cutting contracts to small business, I've gotten 5 of my 23%, I'm done. Right. It's, well, how about the small software companies? How about the women-owned or the veteran-owned additive manufacturing company? How about coming up with a strategic approach that says we don't necessarily give everybody the exact same goals and quotas. We address this in a strategic way.
All right. On the 30th of January, the President signed an executive order requiring agencies to eliminate 2 regulations for every 1 new regulation. How has the panel taken this into account?
I don't think we've really looked at that because I think we really are fundamentally trying to figure out how you overhaul the system to be responsive to the threats and challenges the department faces. But let me talk about that in the context of the Regulatory Reform Task Force, because I think what most people don't realize is that whole 2-for-1 thing is just the headline. This administration is talking about a fundamentally different approach to regulation. So it's not only the 2-for-1, but it is the cost of that regulation, it is the benefits of that regulation over time, and it's about eliminating regulations and promulgating regulations that are actually cost neutral. So it's beyond the 2-for-1. It really is a very, very different approach to regulation in this country. And I think this is going to be fascinating, at least from my perspective, because I think we see played out in graphically relief today that we're getting this lesson in civics about co-equal branches of the government. So the dilemma will come from Congress giving us things in the NDAA and other bills which we need to write regulations to implement, and our senior leadership in the administration going, well, what are you going to give up for those things? And us saying, we've gotten this to the irreducible minimum, and to not write a regulation, we may have to defy the will of Congress. So I think we're in for a version of the old African proverb, when the elephants dance, the grass suffers.
Anyone else on that? So you've talked a little bit about the young workforce that we have out there and how talented they are. Has the panel, are you going to get inputs from the young new starts in the business to hear what their ideas are?
Yeah,
Well, we've actually been doing that.
Yeah.
Early on, we had a meeting with the, and some of you may know that OFPP runs what they call the Frontline Forum, where they bring in acquisition practitioners to actually talk to the Office of Federal Procurement policymakers. We did a joint session with the Frontline Forum where they were concentrating on bringing in professionals under 40. So people in their 30s, right. And lest you say, well, what are those old farts? No, kind of the idea is you want people who've been in the system long enough to have actually operated parts of the system, but not so long that they got barnacles growing off of them like the four of us do. That was really instructive for us. Some of the things that they talked about were things that.
Right.
Yeah.
We at the NCMA GCMS, we 809 panel met in conjunction with that, and we had a session with the Contract Management Leadership Development Program selectees, and a couple hours with them, and they provide a lot of the same inputs here at industry and government folks as part of that, and so they did that. And in fact, a couple of them then volunteered to work on the 809 panel and are doing that and are part of the staffers. So getting a lot of that kind of input has been valuable, but yes, we are.
Yeah. So Terry says a couple of them. We've been here for most of the week with Jarrett Lane and Ryan Polk, two millennials who,
right.
They are, and they are bold. And
right.
We heard from one of your troops, Matt Flaherty, and by the way, Matt did a magnificent job. Recommend him for below the zone promotion to major. He was. He's sitting up there with SESs, 15s, and a colonel,
holding his own.
And holding his own.
Yeah.
But I think that's an excellent question, because it is important to ask, what do we bring to the table? Because we've been doing this for 30 years, and we've got paradigms and hard set views on things like that. So it truly is important that we hear from even folks like those in the audience here, and Darryl and others have talked about what we're doing to get to folks. But we've got to be careful as we craft solutions, recommendations, that we don't fall into the old paradigms of how we think about the world, because we've lived it for over 30 years in our careers. And I think that's extremely important. And we hope that we'll continue to hear from people as they...
Charlie's got an excellent point. I don't know that we fully appreciate the extent to which the technology that existed in the 80s and 90s drove the choices we made about how to implement. Congress gave us lots of latitude in the laws that existed at that time, And I think a lot of the things we decided to do were constrained by technology. I mean, consider when FAR was written, we didn't even have Fed Biz Ops.
Right.
But I'll tell you, I think if we craft a set of prescriptive policy alternatives, we will have failed. And I say that because the rate of change is such that if we do that, there will be another group of, old farts as opposed to acquisition giants sitting here in 5 years having the same conversation. So as we've looked at this, and this has been fascinating to me, and I will only speak for myself, but what I have heard and seen are a lot of self-inflicted wounds, okay, things that are not driven by statute or regulation, but are driven by culture and what I call the criminalization of judgment, right? So what we have done is we have created a system where the sanction for making a good faith mistake or something short of misfeasance is so disproportionately higher than the act itself that we drive ourselves into fail-safe systems and we're reluctant to take risks. I see a workforce that is frankly overworked, being told to focus on production, rather than perhaps some critical structural thinking. And I believe it's really got to be the goal of this panel to craft legislative and regulatory alternatives that represent frameworks in which people can operate rather than prescriptions for how they operate. And if we don't do that, we will have failed.
Yeah, I would go a little further relative to the millennials and the workforce changes from, I have 9 days left as NCMA president. But one of the things I worry about a lot in that position is the workforce and the membership and what drives those things. And Charlie's the president-elect of NCMA, so it's you get a lot of that too. And he's got these things. I've handed him the whole list to start worrying about.
Thank you very much.
But it's we have an NCMA membership of lots of baby boomers and not many millennials, but that can't work. And it's the same thing with the acquisition workforce, both in industry and government. And I think you have to look at that workforce as both, because you need a well-trained acquisition workforce in industry just as much as you need it in the government, or you're just going to have mismatches there constantly. And we're all wrestling with this idea of how do we make those adjustments, how over the next 10 years when there will be a sea change in terms of the age groups that are there and how they think and how they want to be communicated with and how they want to be trained. And so we are looking at some recommendations around those as well to the degree we can.
So, Elliott, you talked about prescriptive language. Are you all looking at revising or drastically changing the source selection procedures? Because it seems those are much driven by being safe, being risk averse, and they drive timelines.
And those are a self-inflicted wound.
Yeah. Yep.
All right.
Absolutely.
So I think there needs to be a fulsome discussion within the department about what those look like outside the panel, because we can do that out of DPAP. That's guidance. It's not regulation. But I will observe something. I think those things were useful. And the reason I think they were useful for a season was they put the services and the defense agencies on a common baseline with respect to how to approach source selection. And I think they gave industry, some sense of what they were going to see. And industry, I think, appreciates some level of predictability and stability at some point in time. But I think now it's probably time to revisit those things philosophically, to take out perhaps some of the prescriptions as to what we do and how we do it, and say, now that we have alignment, let's keep what works. Let's not fix that, and take out the things that we really don't need to do. So I think there's been some value in them, but this is I think, very typical of why we have this panel sitting here. You know, we fix things once, and then we go on automatic, and then lo and behold, we look up and we go, my God, it was 15 years since we've revisited that. Has anybody taken a look at that to see if it's relevant?
So I would hope that we would, that what we will do is provide people more flexible frameworks, suggestions of some tools or where they might go to look for some tools that handle things differently. But really, if we get down to the point where the 809 panel is making detailed recommendations about source selection, my feeling is we are lost in the weeds.
Yeah, absolutely.
Our job is to concentrate on strategic level changes that can allow us to build a system that can respond to emerging threats, that operates with speed, that links us closer to what the warriors need, that allows innovation and allows the workforce to fully self-actualize. But getting down to rewriting color codes and as an Air Force officer, I'm still angry.
Well, Darryl's absolutely right. I mean, that's the practice. To me, it gets back to what Elliott already mentioned, and that is, how do we look at competition? And that really that's the thing. So you're talking about CACI, and what do you do around that? Do you recommend changes in that? And there's certainly some of us that are advocating that. But how you define competition and generate it and deal with it then becomes, I think, a driving force when you get to source selection. That's the fundamental change and the strategic change.
Yesterday, we spent quite a bit of time talking about what we're calling dissimilar source selection. It's how do you allow one offer to come in and say, I have a gadget, and this gadget will do a great job of solving your problem. Another guy comes in and says, I offer gadgetry as a service from the cloud that will solve your problem. And a third guy comes in and says, gadgets aren't necessary if you just adopt this technology. How do you build a framework where you can compete those? Because right now, by the way, that is permitted in today's rules, but nobody knows how to do it.
Right.
But I think this conversation around prescriptive versus less prescriptive is an important one too, and it's difficult because there are times when prescriptive language is good and useful. I mean, and what we often do is we decide that if a little of something is good, a lot of it must be even better, right? And at the end of the day, we tilt the pendulum way towards one side because we just got mad at the other side, and we always find out that we push it.
My analogy is the way you stop shoplifting is you make all the customers turn their pockets inside out as they leave the store. I mean, that's the way we treat it. We say that the threat of a mistake is, and this goes to Elliott's criminalization of judgment. The reaction is way disproportionate. If somebody makes a mistake, you go train that person, give them opportunities, provide them a safe space in which to try things out. You don't go punish not only them, but all the thems that might make that mistake someday in the future.
So making regulatory changes is a time-sucking activity, right? I mean, the past acquisition reforms have been almost run into each other while we were still catching up the regulatory changes. Do you expect the panel to get special dispensation, or how do you expect to quickly implement the revisions that you plan to have?
Well, we've been charged to develop line-in, line-out language and provide that to the staff. So that would help some, and that process was actually, they did that in the 800 panel as well. But providing that kind of direct support to them so they've got something to act with would make a big difference, and we're certainly going to do that, and the staff is working on a lot of things to do that. That's part of the unraveling of what all the rules and regulations are, because you got to know what you got to change before you start changing it, and that's what we're doing there. I think too, just in terms of the speed of it, there are a lot of things going on. Congress is passing lots of regulation change right now with acquisition. There's more sections of the latest NDAA in terms of acquisition reform than there's ever been before, so they're very interested in this. And a lot of it's going to just result in the timing. If you go back to the 800 panel, a lot of those changes with the fast and fair were the result of there was a defense management review going on. There were other things going on that sort of all came into place at one time, and suddenly you got it. And hopefully we'll be fortunate enough to have some luck like that as well,
Right.
that would do it.
So that'll be helpful.
Yeah.
So we have some questions from the audience, if you all are willing and able.
Of course.
First, so have we concluded that, one, the FAR is too complex, or two, too antiquated, or three, used as policy versus empowerment?
No.
Right. No.
Next question.
So let me talk a little bit about this. I am a passionate fan of boilerplate. Why? Because we have discussed it, we have legislated it, we have regulated it, we have litigated it, we have turned it over to a fare thee well until most of the parties involved in a transaction have said, enough. We understand how this works. We understand that this functions as a constraint or an opportunity, and we know how to deal with it. People often talk about using the Uniform Commercial Code or going to OTAs. And frankly, if you understand what the Uniform Commercial Code is as a statute, it's a gap filler. If you read Section 1 of the Uniform Commercial Code, what it will tell you is that the parties are allowed to bargain to agreement within an almost unlimited set of parameters, except for those that violate public policy. And then it goes on to say, and if the parties bargain to these, and the parties fail to bargain to these things, here is a statute that functions as a gap filler. So I think it is a mistake on our part to believe that regulation is not a good thing. Regulation provides a certain bit of stability, predictability, agreement, so that not every aspect of the deal has to be done over again every single time.
And,
we've not concluded that the idea of regulation is improper. I think what we have decided is we really need to weed the garden, and we need to plant the crops for the future that we're all going to face, understanding full well that future is very different from the past that we have lived through.
It's interesting. Of all the testimony we've gotten, there's very little that has come forward suggesting things that you couldn't do today with today's regulatory framework. So my answer is slightly different than Elliott's in that I do think the regulatory framework we've gotten now is so complex and relatively poorly organized for the way we operate today. Now, that doesn't, I'm not accusing the FAR and the DFAR of being poorly organized per se. I'm just saying we operate differently and we're envisioning operating differently. So it's probably worth looking at, is there a different way to organize the same set of guidelines and principles to make it easier to use in today's environment?
Joe, a colleague of mine, after we released the interim report, came up to me and said, I'm very disappointed, and this is someone I respect and a leader that I've worked with for a long time. Very disappointed because essentially you guys said that the acquisition regulations are broken. And I said, I think you've read it wrong. At least from my perspective, I would not say that the acquisition regulations are broken. I would say, though, that consistent with what Elliott and Darryl have said, is that they are probably not the regulations that we need to serve what we have to do in the future. And so we have to look at them and make the changes necessary, because these acquisition regulations, the DFAR and the FAR, have produced the best military capability that the world has today. The question is it this set of regulations that will allow us to achieve what we need to achieve in the future? And I would say no.
And so let's not be, shy about that. Let's just go do what we need to do without thinking that everything that's been done in the past is bad. It's just that we've got a different world situation today, and if we don't do the right things from an acquisition perspective, we're not going to enable our warfighters to do what they need to do in the face of the world challenges that we have.
Yeah, I think the thing I see is that the markets have changed so much. The FAR today and the regulatory system was in place when DoD dominated markets. And today, there are many markets that buys things in, and it's a tiny percentage. And so when you think about that and in terms of how you compete, how you buy, we do need a regulation that's more sensitive to those market changes and allows flexibility to deal with those markets and then understand them. I mean, really, there's got to be an incentive created around behavior that recognizes that. And that's one area that I think in terms of it's antiquated. It's built around a system that was for buying hardware, and yet today 60% of our spend is services, and probably growing as we try to deal with budget challenges. And so how do you buy those? So do I think that there's an aspect of it that does need to reflect when we talk about what we're facing in the future, both in terms of the threat, but also how we have to deal with industry and back and forth. I mean, that's critical.
So along those lines, one of the questions that was from the audience is, do you expect the changes that you're going to implement to be evolutionary or revolutionary?
Yes.
Yes. Because how many parts of the FAR are there? I mean, some parts will be revolutionary, some will be evolutionary.
I think that's true.
Great, that's exciting. I'm looking for
We call it bold.
I like
Yeah, we call it
revolutionary. Yeah.
If you think about legal traditions in the Western world, right? Very few countries use civil law on the French model. It's primarily common law, and this essentially is an act of making private law. So everything builds on each other. I mean, there are certain enduring principles that remain no matter how you shape them, for the world that you think. So if anybody thinks we are going to take 600 years of common law around how people determine what their rights and obligations are with relative to the creation of value, then you're just living in the wrong country.
Interesting. So this is a more specific question. Is there a plan within the scope of the 809 panel to standardize proposal data formats?
God, no.
Such as executable models?
No.
That's below the weeds.
Yeah.
Okay. So you were not looking at things quite that tactically.
No.
So what is the panel's opinion on the certified cost and pricing data requirement for vendors over $750K?
I started to answer that one's in the weeds too, but one of the things I will say is we're looking at thresholds generally, and one of the folks who testified in front of us mentioned that there was something like 62 different thresholds that are found in 390 some odd portions of the FAR, and we think that's part of the complexity that could be simplified. If you had a simpler regime of thresholds where as much stuff is common as you can, and then you look at areas where there would be a significant gain if we raise thresholds for certain kind of activities. We are looking at that, but we're not, noodling in and saying we're going to take TINA apart and put it back together.
All right, we're going to look at all thresholds in the FAR. We're working with the DAR Council folks to do that. There's a matrix today that's available, the DAR Council has up on the web, that's for those thresholds that can be indexed. There's also other thresholds. We are discussing now looking at some financial thresholds as well. Back to your question about how would you, the issue about mission first, how do we do some of these things faster, providing some flexibility in the FAR that would allow somebody to make some decisions around how they apply things, the thresholds. That allows you to make some decisions at an operational level about mission focus. And then if you do provide higher thresholds, and of course everybody's Some people want $1 billion threshold, and some want $1.50. It just depends on where they're coming from. But if there's ways around that to structure more flexibility for the workforce, I think that's really what our goal is there when we get to that.
Now, in keeping with this audience and the purpose of this conference, I would say, one of the things that not necessarily just the 809 panel, because it's probably not something we're going to spend a lot of time on, but we are going to talk about workforce. And one of the things that you could do with the workforce is the department could do a better job of training on price analysis and how to effectively use price analysis. Because if you can use price analysis to establish price, then you don't necessarily, the number of circumstances where you may not need cost and pricing data expand.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I think we may be having the wrong conversation around this. Because if you look at our pricing model, what we do is we say the default is to rely on the market. Whether it's competition, whether it is price analysis, whether it's analogous, buys, so forth. And when that doesn't scratch the itch, we automatically go to the other side of cost analysis. Mm-hmm. And if you think about cost analysis is essentially a utility model, right? So when we ran power companies before deregulation, what we would do is we would send in armies of accountants to look at cost structures, and we would send them in to look at capital structures. And then, the state board would say, and a fair return on these assets and in this cost structure is such and such a percent. And based on that, we will set utility rates. And that's kind of what we do. I mean, if you think about weighted guidelines and those sorts of things, that's really where we move when we can't get it from price analysis or competition. And the dilemma that I have is, or I guess the question I have is, so how do you ever get to first mover technology?
Yeah.
Because I have no marketplace for it, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because it is first mover technology. And the people that I want to buy it from may not even have the kind of cost records, let alone be willing to let me dig into their cost structure as if they were the electric company. So there's got to be a different pricing paradigm that fills in the middle.
I'm so disappointed. I thought the moment had arrived when Elliott and I were going to disagree. Things were really going to get spicy. But unfortunately, that moment hasn't come yet. I agree with Elliott. But what I would say is the conversation needs to move to a conversation about value, not about cost or utility. The value of a first mover advantage, going looking at it and saying, gee whiz, if I can sweep broad areas of the ocean without having to send out an active signal, what is the value to the submarine force or to the surface Navy of being able to do that? And if only one guy offers it, what's a fair price?
I'll suggest to you that it is this issue. If we don't figure this out, we won't get to those companies who are willing to go sell to the Chinese very readily because they're not going to expose themselves to the rigors of our processes. We've got to figure that out.
Yeah.
So are you hearing from commercial industry in your panel discussions to get ideas from them?
Yes.
Do I count?
Absolutely.
Huh?
Do I count?
Yeah.
No.
Well, I guess I mean beyond like DoD-centric.
Yes, absolutely.
We are. We've got one of our teams is focused on barriers to entry, and we've done a whole lot of communications with companies who don't play in our business. Mm-hmm. They'd like to in some cases, but they don't today for many of the reasons that we've talked about. So we're hearing a lot of things from companies who are extremely commercial, and they've got a lot of good ideas.
Yeah. So an interesting question came in from the audience. Have you all thought about, so once these changes get implemented, we've got contracts in existence that already have all the standing clauses. Have you thought about how we're going to maintain those contracts, do post-audits of those contracts, or I mean, that could be dramatic amount of work if we're going to try to change existing.
Well,
contracts.
I'd ask whoever asked that question to use their imagination. Because if I have a fundamentally different business model that advantages both sides, there's no reason I couldn't take that deal and restructure it to reflect those new realities. So don't think, we're necessarily going to have this stuff over here that we're maintaining until it dies while we have this stuff over here. I would challenge you all as business leaders to say, strategically, when does it advantage me to sit down with my partner and negotiate an agreement that reflects these new realities and essentially causes this one to die? And when does it make sense for me to allow that one to live because perhaps we're too close to delivery or it just doesn't make sense for that kind of commodity? I think it's a more nuanced answer than how are you mechanically going to maintain the two sets?
And Elliott makes a great point. I think, along with that, it's use your imagination and innovate.